When I walked into Christmas dinner wearing my old wool coat, my daughter-in-law laughed so hard she spilled wine across the table. "Oh my God, Evelyn," she said, staring at my clothes. "You look like you slept in your car." Everyone froze. Even my son looked away. I just smiled, folded my gloves, and sat down quietly while snow fell outside the window. Then my granddaughter asked, "Grandma, are you poor now?" Vanessa laughed again. But what none of them knew was this. 2 days earlier, my late husband's lawyer had called me with a secret that was about to destroy their perfect little Christmas forever. Did she lose everything? My granddaughter whispered the moment I walked into Christmas dinner wearing my old wool coat, and before I could answer, my daughter-in-law burst into laughter so loud the entire dining room went silent. The sound echoed against the crystal glasses and polished hardwood floors like something sharp breaking in half. Vanessa pressed one manicured hand against her chest, trying to catch her breath while red wine sloshed over the rim of her glass onto the white linen tablecloth. "Oh my God, Evelyn," she said between laughs, staring at my coat like it was something embarrassing dragged in from the street. "I didn't realize we were doing charity cases this year." No one said a word. Not my son, not my grandson, not even Vanessa's sister, who suddenly became very interested in adjusting the silverware beside her plate. I stood there quietly with snow melting onto my shoes, my fingers still wrapped around the small tin of homemade peppermint cookies I had spent all morning baking. Outside the window, thick snowflakes drifted slowly across the dark December sky, covering the quiet Connecticut neighborhood in white. The Carter family home looked beautiful from the outside. Warm golden lights glowed through the windows. Garland wrapped around the staircase. A 12-foot Christmas tree sparkled in the corner of the living room beside the fireplace. It looked like the kind of Christmas family people dream about. But the moment Vanessa laughed at me, I realized something painful. I was no longer part of the picture they were trying to create. "Mom," my son Daniel finally muttered, not even looking directly at me, "you could have told us you needed something nicer to wear." His voice wasn't cruel exactly. That almost made it worse. It sounded embarrassed, like I was the problem standing in the middle of his perfect holiday dinner. I looked down at my coat. Brown wool, slightly faded at the sleeves. The same coat Harold bought me 14 years ago during a trip to Vermont right after his bypass surgery. He had smiled when I tried it on in that tiny little shop near the inn. "You look elegant in everything," he told me back then. I remembered that moment so clearly that for one painful second, I could almost hear his voice again over the sound of crackling firewood and clinking wine glasses. But Harold had been gone for almost 3 years now, and after he died, everything in this family changed quietly, little by little, like lights slowly shutting off in a house room by room. Vanessa crossed her arms and leaned back against the kitchen island, her diamond bracelet catching the Christmas lights. "Honestly," she said with a tight smile, "I just thought maybe tonight could feel a little more festive." A few nervous chuckles circled the table. My grandson looked down at his mashed potatoes. My granddaughter kept staring at my coat. I smiled softly, the same way women my age learn to smile when they understand humiliation too well to react to it anymore. Then I removed my gloves carefully and placed them beside my plate. "The roads were icy," I said calmly. I wasn't thinking about fashion. Vanessa smirked and took another sip of wine. Daniel finally stood and pulled out a chair for me near the far end of the table beside the kitchen doorway. Not beside him. Not beside the grandchildren. The far corner. The place where people sat when they didn't really belong in the conversation anymore. I walked toward the chair slowly, feeling every pair of eyes following me across the dining room. The smell of rosemary turkey and cinnamon candles filled the air, but underneath it was something colder. Something hollow. I sat down quietly and folded my napkin onto my lap while Vanessa resumed talking about their ski trip to Aspen and the kitchen renovation they planned to start after New Year's. Marble countertops, imported lighting, heated floors. She spoke loudly, proudly, making sure everyone heard every expensive detail. Then my granddaughter Emily looked at me innocently and asked the question that froze the entire room. "Grandma Evelyn," she said softly, "are you poor now?" The silence that followed felt heavier than the snowstorm outside. Vanessa lowered her wine glass slowly. Daniel looked horrified, but I didn't answer right away, because at that exact moment, my phone vibrated quietly inside my purse with a message from the one person Vanessa never expected to hear from again. Harold's lawyer. I did not reach for my phone right away. I simply stared at my granddaughter across the table while her question hung in the air between the candlelight and the sound of Christmas music playing softly from the living room speakers. Are you poor now? Children have a way of saying the things adults carefully avoid. Emily was only 8. She did not understand humiliation yet. She did not understand why her father suddenly looked sick to his stomach or why Vanessa quickly forced a smile, so tight it barely reached her eyes. Emily, Daniel said sharply, that is enough. But the damage had already settled over the table like fresh snow. I looked down at the gold-rimmed china plate in front of me and smoothed the edge of my napkin slowly. My hands looked older lately, thinner, the veins more visible beneath my skin. Harold used to kiss those hands every Christmas morning before we opened presents with Daniel downstairs by the fireplace. Back then our house smelled like pine needles and cinnamon rolls before sunrise. Daniel would run down the stairs in striped pajamas while Harold pretended to complain about being awake too early. We were never rich people, not in the way Vanessa cared about, but our home had always felt warm, full, safe. I could still remember the year Daniel turned 10, and Harold spent 2 entire weekends building him a wooden hockey shelf for his bedroom because we could not afford the expensive one he wanted from the catalog. Daniel hugged his father like he had been handed the world. That little boy used to cry if he thought I looked tired. Somewhere along the years after law school and promotions and country club memberships, that boy slowly disappeared. Mom, Daniel's voice pulled me back into the dining room. You okay? I nodded once and finally reached into my purse for my phone. Vanessa immediately looked away and lifted her wine glass again, but I noticed the quick tension in her shoulders. Fear. Small but there. The message on my screen was short. Call me before midnight. It is important. Thomas Reynolds. My chest tightened slightly. Thomas Reynolds had been Harold's attorney for almost 30 years. Tweetman. Careful with words. He was the kind of lawyer who still mailed handwritten Christmas cards every December. I had not spoken to him in months. Everything all right? Vanessa asked casually, though she watched me too closely when she said it. I slipped the phone back into my purse. Just an old friend, I answered. Her expression changed for only a second. Most people would not have noticed it. But women my age notice everything, because silence teaches you to study faces the way younger people study words. Dinner continued awkwardly after that. Vanessa resumed talking about their upcoming New Year's party while Daniel kept checking his wine glass instead of looking at me. Emily stayed quiet. Even the twins stopped arguing over dinner rolls. I barely tasted the food on my plate. The turkey was dry around the edges. The green beans were overcooked. Vanessa had ordered most of the meal from a catering company downtown, though she would probably spend the entire evening accepting compliments for preparing it herself. That was another thing I had learned about my daughter-in-law. She loved appearances more than experiences. The perfect Christmas photo mattered more to her than the actual people sitting around the table. Halfway through dessert, Vanessa stood and clinked her fork gently against her wine glass. Before everyone leaves, she announced brightly, we should take our family Christmas picture while the snow still looks pretty outside. Everyone agreed immediately. Chairs scraped against hardwood floors while coats and wine glasses were moved aside. Vanessa carefully positioned everyone near the fireplace beneath the garland and stockings. Daniel stood beside her with one arm around Emily. The twins sat cross-legged on the rug. Then Vanessa glanced toward me and smiled politely. Evelyn, she said, maybe you should stand near the back this time. The lighting is a little tricky near the fireplace. Near the back. I understood exactly what she meant. My coat. My age. My tired face. I quietly moved where she pointed without arguing. The photographer counted down while everyone smiled toward the camera. But right before the flash went off, I noticed Vanessa subtly shift sideways, just enough for her shoulder to block almost my entire body from the picture. And in that moment, standing half-hidden behind my own family beside a glowing Christmas tree, I realized something cold and undeniable. Vanessa was not simply embarrassed by me. She was trying to erase me. The drive home felt longer than usual that night. Snow covered the empty Connecticut roads in soft white layers while old Christmas songs played quietly through the radio speakers of my aging Buick. I kept both hands steady on the steering wheel and tried not to think about the family photograph. Tried not to picture Vanessa shifting sideways at the last second so I would disappear behind her shoulder like an unwanted stranger standing too close to someone else's celebration. At 71 years old, you learn there are humiliations louder than screaming. Some arrive dressed in smiles and polite voices. Some happen in front of fireplaces while everyone holds glasses of wine and pretend they are good people. By the time I pulled into my driveway, fresh snow had already covered the front steps of my small colonial house. The porch light flickered softly against the dark. Harold used to complain every winter that I refused to replace that light bulb properly. It has character, I always told him. He would laugh and kiss my forehead while carrying groceries inside. I sat in the car for a moment after turning off the engine. The silence pressed against me heavily. 3 years ago, this driveway still felt like home. Now it just felt quiet. I carried the untouched tin of peppermint cookies inside and placed it carefully on the kitchen counter beside the sink. The house smelled faintly like cedarwood and old books. Harold's reading chair still sat beside the living room window exactly where he left it. I had tried moving it once after the funeral, but the room immediately felt wrong, so I moved it back before sunrise. Some grief settles into furniture. Some marriages leave fingerprints on entire houses. I removed my coat slowly and hung it near the door. The sleeves looked more worn under the brighter kitchen lights. Vanessa was right about one thing. It was old. But she did not know why I still wore it. None of them did. They did not know that 6 months after Harold died, Daniel called me at almost midnight sounding terrified because his investment group was collapsing. They did not know I quietly liquidated most of my retirement savings to help him avoid public embarrassment. Daniel cried that night. Actually cried. "I will pay you back, Mom," he promised over and over. "I just need time." I told him not to worry about it because that is what mothers do. We protect our children first and ask questions later. Afterward, I stopped buying unnecessary things. No more vacations. No new clothes.
No jewelry.
I even canceled the landscaping service Harold loved because I could manage the yard myself with enough patience. The funny thing was I never felt poor. Lonely sometimes. Tired often. But never poor. Not until tonight. Tonight was the first time someone managed to make me feel small for surviving quietly. My phone buzzed again against the kitchen counter. Thomas Reynolds. I stared at the screen before answering. "Thomas," I said softly. "Merry Christmas." His voice sounded older than I remembered. Slower. "Evelyn," he replied carefully. "I am sorry to call this late, but there is something you need to know immediately." I lowered myself into the kitchen chair beside the window, while snow continued falling outside. What happened? There was a long pause on the other end. Papers shuffled faintly. I reviewed some trust activity connected to Harold's estate this afternoon, he finally said. And certain recent requests concerned me. My stomach tightened. Requests from who? Another pause. From Vanessa Carter. I looked automatically toward the dark hallway, as if someone inside the house might overhear us. "I do not understand," I whispered. Thomas exhaled slowly. 3 weeks ago, your daughter-in-law contacted my office asking questions about transferring property ownership and long-term care authorization. I felt suddenly cold despite the heat running through the vents. Long-term care? Yes, he answered carefully. Specifically assisted living placement options tied to asset restructuring. For several seconds, I could not speak at all. My eyes drifted toward the living room where Harold's chair sat quietly in the shadows beside the Christmas tree I had decorated alone this year. Gold ornaments, white lights, the same angel topper we bought during our first year of marriage. I remembered Vanessa smiling tonight while telling everyone about heated marble floors and Aspen vacations. I remembered Daniel avoiding my eyes during dinner. And slowly, painfully, the pieces inside my mind began sliding together into something far uglier than humiliation. Vanessa was not simply embarrassed by me. She was preparing for a future where I no longer stood in the way. I barely slept after that phone call. Long after midnight, I sat alone at the kitchen table with only the stove light glowing softly across the room while snow piled against the windows outside. Thomas Reynolds had not said much more before ending the call. He was careful with his words, the way lawyers always are when they believe something dangerous is unfolding quietly behind closed doors. But he had said enough. Vanessa had contacted his office repeatedly over the past month. Questions about ownership transfers. Questions about medical authorization. Questions about assisted living communities in Florida and Arizona. Places with smiling brochures and palm trees on the covers where elderly people disappeared politely from family dinners and holiday photographs. I thought Harold would want you informed, Thomas told me before hanging up.
Something
About this situation does not feel right. After the call ended, I walked slowly through the house, turning off Christmas lights one by one. The tree in the living room blinked softly in the darkness, while old Bing Crosby songs played low from the record player Harold bought at an estate sale years ago. Every ornament on that tree carried a memory. Daniel's handmade paper snowman from second grade. The glass bell we bought during our trip to Maine in 1996. The silver angel Harold insisted looked exactly like me, even though it did not. I touched the edge of one ornament carefully and suddenly realized something painful. Vanessa had not built this family. She had inherited it. Every tradition she now controlled once belonged to me. The Christmas dinners, the guest lists, the recipes, the photographs. Even the dining room table where she laughed at my coat had been chosen by Harold and me after nearly 4 months of saving. And now somehow I had become the outsider in a life I created. Around 2 a.m, I finally opened the old cedar chest in my bedroom closet. Inside were documents Harold insisted I keep safe after his health started declining. Insurance papers, property records, trust agreements. Most of it had not been touched since the funeral. My fingers trembled slightly as I sorted through the folders beneath the soft yellow lamp beside the bed. Then I found the blue file, labeled Carter Family Trust. Harold's handwriting. Strong and neat, even during the final years when arthritis began stiffening his hands. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it carefully. Outside, snow tapped softly against the windows. Inside the folder were pages of legal language I barely understood at first glance. But one sentence immediately caught my attention. Primary residential property may not be sold, transferred, or restructured without written consent from Evelyn Carter. I read the sentence 3 times slowly, then a 4th. My stomach tightened harder with every word. Vanessa had no authority over this house. Neither did Daniel. Not without me. Which meant one thing. Whatever plans Vanessa was making behind my back, she had either misunderstood the trust completely, or she was hoping I never looked closely enough to stop her. I leaned back against the headboard and stared toward Harold's side of the bed, still untouched except for the folded quilt resting near his pillow. I remembered the night before he died. Snow had fallen that evening too. Harold looked exhausted but strangely peaceful while sitting beside me in this very room. "Promise me something," he said quietly back then. "Do not let anyone make you feel unnecessary after I am gone." I laughed softly at the time because the idea seemed impossible. Daniel loved me. We were family. But grief changes people. So does money. Especially people who care too much about appearances. Suddenly, dozens of small moments from the past year returned to me differently. Vanessa insisting I stop hosting holidays because it was too much stress at my age. Daniel casually suggesting I should consider moving somewhere smaller now that rattling around this house alone could not be healthy. Vanessa repeatedly asking where important paperwork was stored after Harold passed away. At the time, I convinced myself she was simply trying to help. Now, every conversation felt colder in hindsight, calculated. I closed the trust folder slowly and rested my hands on top of it. The room felt painfully quiet except for the ticking grandfather clock downstairs. Then another memory surfaced. Earlier that evening at dinner, right before dessert, Vanessa briefly stepped into the hallway to answer a phone call. I had overheard only part of her sentence while passing by toward the bathroom. "Once the paperwork is done," she whispered sharply. The house will finally be ours. At the time I told myself I must have misunderstood. But now, sitting alone in the dim light of my bedroom holding legal documents against my chest, I realized something far worse than humiliation was happening inside my family. Vanessa was not laughing at my old coat because she thought I looked poor. She was laughing because she already believed everything I owned belonged to her. The next morning, the house felt colder than usual even though the heat was running steadily through the vents. Gray winter light spilled across the kitchen counters while the coffee maker hissed softly beside the sink. I barely slept more than 2 hours, but exhaustion no longer mattered. Something inside me had shifted during the night. For months, maybe even years, I had been moving through life like a woman apologizing for taking up space. Now suddenly I could see everything too clearly to keep pretending. I poured myself coffee into Harold's favorite mug and sat at the kitchen table with the trust documents spread neatly in front of me. Outside, snow covered the neighborhood in perfect silence. Across the street, the Henderson children were already building a snowman beside their mailbox while their mother waved from the porch, wearing red mittens and a knitted scarf. Everything looked peaceful, normal. That was the strange thing about betrayal. It usually unfolds in ordinary places. Nice homes, clean kitchens, family dinners with cinnamon candles burning beside expensive wine glasses. My phone buzzed around 9:30. Daniel. I stared at his name for several seconds before answering. Morning, Mom, he said carefully. His voice sounded tense, almost rehearsed. You made it home okay last night? I looked down at the untouched coffee cooling slowly between my hands. I did. A short silence followed. I could practically hear him searching for the right words. About dinner, he finally began. Vanessa feels bad if things came across the wrong way. If things came across the wrong way. Not if they hurt me. Not if humiliating me in front of the grandchildren was cruel. Just if it looked bad. I see, I answered quietly. Daniel exhaled softly. You know how she jokes sometimes. Yes. I did know. Vanessa's jokes always seemed to target the weakest person in the room. Emily did not mean anything by her question either, he added quickly. She is just a kid. I stared out the kitchen window at the falling snow. Children usually repeat what they hear adults say at home. Daniel immediately went silent. That silence told me more than words ever could. I closed the trust folder carefully. Daniel, I said softly, has Vanessa been looking into assisted living communities for me? The pause. This time lasted too long. What? He finally asked, but his voice cracked slightly. No. Why would you ask that? He was lying. I knew it instantly. Mothers know the sound of their children lying long before they learn their first multiplication tables. Thomas Reynolds called me last night, I said calmly. Another silence. Longer now. Heavier. Then Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. Mom, you are misunderstanding things. Am I? Vanessa was only researching options. Just planning ahead. You live alone now, and we worry about you. Planning ahead. Like I was becoming a problem to solve instead of a person still alive. I am 71, Daniel. I replied quietly. Not 95. Nobody is saying otherwise. But someone clearly was. The conversation ended politely a few minutes later, though nothing about it felt normal anymore. After hanging up, I remained seated at the kitchen table for a long time listening to the grandfather clock ticking softly in the hallway. Every sound inside the house suddenly felt sharper, more revealing. Then another memory surfaced unexpectedly. Last spring, Vanessa insisted they host Easter at their place for the first time. I remembered arriving early with homemade pies only to overhear Vanessa speaking to one of her friends in the kitchen before she noticed me standing nearby. Honestly, she whispered with a small laugh, I cannot wait until we finally redo Harold's old house. It has amazing bones, but everything about it screams 1990. At the time I told myself she was only talking about interior design. Now I understood something much uglier hidden beneath her words. She was never imagining herself visiting this house. She was imagining owning it. Around noon, I drove downtown to meet Thomas Reynolds at his office near Main Street. The old brick building smelled faintly like paper, coffee, and cedarwood polish. Thomas looked older than I remembered. His silver hair thinner now, reading glasses balanced low on his nose. But the moment I sat across from him in his office, his expression turned serious. He slid a folder slowly across the desk toward me. "Evelyn," he said carefully, "there are several things about Vanessa's recent requests that concern me deeply." My fingers tightened against my purse. "What kind of requests?" Thomas removed his glasses slowly and folded his hands together. "She wanted to know how quickly control of the Carter property could transfer if you were declared mentally or physically unable to manage your own affairs." The room suddenly felt too quiet. I stared at him without speaking while snow drifted softly past the office windows behind him. Then Thomas looked directly into my eyes and said the one sentence that made my blood run cold. "And based on the paperwork she recently attempted to submit, I believe your daughter-in-law may already be trying to start that process." For a moment, I could not hear anything except the ticking clock on the wall behind Thomas Reynolds's desk. The office around me blurred slightly while his words settled heavily into my chest. Declared mentally or physically unable. I repeated the phrase silently in my mind because it sounded less like concern and more like removal, like something written about strangers in hospitals or courtrooms, not mothers who still baked Christmas cookies and shoveled their own driveways. Thomas slid several photocopied documents across the desk toward me. "These were submitted electronically through a preliminary inquiry portal last week," he explained carefully. "Nothing official yet, but the language concerned me enough to investigate further." My hands felt strangely calm as I lifted the pages. Vanessa's name appeared neatly across multiple sections beside terms like long-term planning, assisted care consultation, and family management transition. There was even a section asking whether I showed signs of memory decline after bereavement. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Memory decline. Because I forgot to bring cranberry sauce one Thanksgiving after Harold died? Because I once repeated a story about Daniel's childhood twice in the same afternoon? Suddenly, every small moment from the past year twisted into something darker. Vanessa offering to help organize my medications. Vanessa insisting she handle certain bills online because technology gets confusing. Vanessa gently correcting me in front of people whenever I forgot tiny details. At the time, I believed she was trying to be patient. Now I saw what she was really doing. Building a narrative. Quietly. Carefully. Thomas leaned forward slightly in his chair. "Evelyn, I need to ask you something difficult." I looked up slowly. "Do you believe your son is aware of this?" The question hurt more than the documents. Because deep down I already knew the answer. Daniel might not understand the full extent of Vanessa's plans, but he knew enough to stay silent. And silence inside a family can become its own kind of betrayal. "I do not know anymore," I answered honestly. Thomas nodded with the sad expression of a man who had spent decades watching families destroy themselves over money. "Harold anticipated potential pressure after his death," he said quietly. "That is why the trust was written the way it was." I looked down at the folder in my lap. He never told me. He hoped none of this would become necessary. Outside the office window, snow continued drifting softly across Main Street while shoppers moved between decorated storefronts carrying wrapped gifts and coffee cups. Christmas music floated faintly through the glass from somewhere down the block. The whole town looked peaceful. But inside that office, I felt something inside me changing shape completely. Fear was slowly hardening into clarity. When I finally returned home that afternoon, dusk had already settled across the neighborhood. The Christmas lights lining nearby houses glowed softly against the snow while smoke curled from chimneys into the darkening sky. I carried the folder inside carefully and locked the front door behind me. Then I did something I had not done in years. I walked directly into Harold's old study. The room still smelled faintly like leather and cedarwood after all this time. His desk remained exactly as he left it. Pens aligned neatly beside stacked notebooks. Framed photographs from fishing trips in Maine. Daniel's college graduation picture. My wedding portrait in silver frame near the lamp. I sat slowly in Harold's chair and opened the bottom drawer where he kept personal records. Inside were old checkbooks, tax folders, and several handwritten notes attached with paper clips. One envelope immediately caught my attention because my name was written across the front in Harold's careful handwriting. For Evelyn. Only if things become complicated. My throat tightened instantly. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers and unfolded the single sheet inside. Evelyn, if you are reading this, it means something inside our family no longer feels right to you. Trust that feeling. You are not weak for noticing changes in people. You are not imagining things. Some individuals confuse kindness with surrender. Do not let anyone pressure you into leaving this house. It belongs to you, for as long as you wish to stay. And remember something important. The people who truly love you will never rush to replace you. I read the letter twice before lowering it slowly onto the desk. Tears blurred my vision for the first time since Christmas dinner, not because I felt helpless anymore, but because Harold somehow saw this coming before I ever did. Then suddenly my phone buzzed again against the wooden desk surface. A text message from Vanessa. Hope you're feeling better today. Daniel and I were thinking maybe after New Year's we could discuss some easier living options for you. Somewhere warmer and less stressful. I stared at the message for several long seconds. Then my eyes drifted back toward Harold's handwritten letter resting beneath the desk lamp. And for the first time since Vanessa laughed at my coat, I smiled. Over the next few days, I became someone my family no longer recognized. Not louder, not crueler, just quieter in a different way. More observant. I stopped reacting immediately during phone calls. I stopped filling silences to make other people comfortable. And most importantly, I stopped assuming kindness would protect me from manipulation. Vanessa texted me constantly after Christmas. Little messages dressed up as concern. Hope you are staying warm. Let us know if groceries are getting difficult for you. We found a lovely senior community with gardening classes you would absolutely adore. Every message sounded sweet enough to show. Strangers. That was always Vanessa's greatest talent. She never behaved badly in ways people could easily prove. Her cruelty lived inside tone, timing, suggestion. Daniel called twice during that same week, both conversations strangely rushed. He kept asking if I had thought more about making life easier for myself. Easier. Such a harmless-sounding word. But by then, I understood what they really meant. Smaller. Quieter. Out of the way. On New Year's Eve, snow fell heavily again across the neighborhood. I spent the evening alone in Harold's study reviewing every document Thomas Reynolds gave me. The deeper I looked into the trust, the more complicated things became. Harold had protected me far more carefully than I realized. Not only could the house not be sold without my written consent, but a second clause stated that any attempt to pressure, manipulate, or medically coerce me into relinquishing control of family assets would immediately suspend inheritance access for all involved parties, pending legal review. I read that sentence 3 times slowly. Harold knew. Somehow, years before his death, he anticipated exactly the kind of pressure that was now quietly unfolding around me. My eyes drifted toward our wedding photo sitting beside the desk lamp. Harold looked so young in that picture. Dark hair, crooked smile, the kind of face that made you feel safe standing beside it. I suddenly remembered something he told me during one particularly difficult year, when Daniel was a teenager constantly pushing boundaries. Character does not disappear under pressure, Harold said back then while washing dinner dishes beside me. Pressure reveals it. At the time, I thought he was talking about raising children. Now, I realized he understood something much larger about people. Around 10 o'clock that night, my phone buzzed with a text from Emily. Grandma, are you mad at me for what I asked at Christmas? My chest tightened instantly. Sweet little Emily. Still innocent enough to feel guilt before manipulation fully teaches children to ignore it. I replied immediately. Of course not, sweetheart. You did nothing wrong. 3 disappeared, then returned again. Finally, another message arrived. Mommy said maybe you get confused sometimes now because Grandpa died. I stared at the screen so long the words began to blur slightly. There it was. Quiet. Careful. Exactly what Thomas warned me about. Vanessa was already planting seeds. Not dramatic accusations. Just tiny suggestions repeated often enough to grow roots. I set the phone down slowly and closed my eyes for a moment. Then another memory surfaced from months earlier. Last summer during a family barbecue, Vanessa corrected me in front of neighbors after I forgot where I placed my reading glasses. "See?" She laughed lightly while handing them to me. "This is why Daniel worries about you living alone." Everyone chuckled politely at the time, even me, but now I could see the performance hidden beneath it. Every small moment had been preparing the same narrative. Elderly widow, forgetful, emotional, vulnerable, easier to manage, easier to remove. I stood and walked toward the living room window where snowflakes drifted beneath the streetlights outside. Across the street, families were celebrating the new year together while television light flickered through curtains and children laughed somewhere in the distance. My own house felt painfully still, but for the first time in months, that stillness no longer frightened me. It gave me space to think clearly. Around midnight, another text arrived from Vanessa. "Happy New Year, Evelyn. Daniel and I were talking tonight, and we really think this year should be about reducing stress for you. We only want what is best." I read the message twice before smiling faintly to myself. Then I walked back into Harold's study, opened the bottom drawer again, and removed the second folder Thomas Reynolds specifically instructed me not to ignore. Inside were financial records connected to Daniel and Vanessa's recent refinancing attempts. Bank statements, loan requests, credit reports. My eyes narrowed slowly as I reviewed the numbers. Aspen vacations, luxury renovations, designer purchases, massive outstanding debt. Suddenly, everything made horrible sense. They were not trying to move me out because they were worried about my health. They needed this house. And judging by the desperation hidden inside those documents, they needed it far more urgently than I ever imagined. The following week, I stopped answering Vanessa's messages immediately. That alone seemed to unsettle her more than anger ever could. People like Vanessa understand conflict. They know how to defend themselves against accusations and tears. But silence makes them nervous because silence gives them nothing to control. Every morning, she sent another carefully polished text wrapped in concern. "Checking on you. Thinking about you. Hoping you are staying warm." Yet beneath every sentence, I could now hear the same hidden urgency. "Move. Sign. Step aside." Meanwhile, I continued reviewing the financial records Thomas Reynolds quietly copied for me. The numbers told a story Daniel never did. Their mortgage had been refinanced twice in under 3 years. Multiple luxury credit accounts were nearly maxed out. There were overdue balances connected to Vanessa's boutique interior design company, a business she constantly bragged about online but which apparently lost money almost every quarter. Expensive vacations, luxury furniture, private school tuition, country club memberships. Their entire life rested on appearances they could no longer afford to maintain. And underneath all of it sat my house. Paid off, valuable, desirable, waiting like a prize they believed would eventually become theirs. One snowy afternoon, Daniel unexpectedly stopped by alone. I watched his SUV pull into the driveway from the living room window while I folded laundry beside the fireplace. For a moment, seeing him step out wearing the same navy winter coat he wore in college almost fooled me into remembering the boy he used to be. He carried no gifts, no groceries, just tension. "Mom," he said softly after stepping inside, stamping snow from his boots near the front door. "You should have told me Thomas contacted you." I folded another towel carefully before answering. Would it have changed anything? Daniel rubbed the back of his neck the way he always did when uncomfortable. Vanessa was only trying to help plan ahead. There it was again. Plan ahead. As though I were weather damage instead of family. I walked slowly into the kitchen and poured coffee into 2 mugs without asking whether he wanted any. He sat quietly at the table while snow drifted outside the windows. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, Daniel sighed heavily. "Mom, you have to understand something." His voice sounded exhausted now. "Things are not as easy as they look." I placed his coffee mug in front of him. "I know." His eyes flickered upward briefly, surprised by my answer. "You do?" "I know about the refinancing. The debts. Vanessa's company." The color drained slowly from his face. He stared at me across the table, like he no longer recognized the woman sitting there. Thomas showed you everything? I nodded once. Daniel looked down into his coffee for a long time. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded smaller somehow. We were going to fix it. By taking my house. He flinched immediately. It was not like that. But it was exactly like that. We both knew it. The kitchen grew painfully quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and distant wind rattling the windows. Then Daniel whispered something I never expected to hear from my own son. Vanessa said if we could move here temporarily and rent our place out, we could recover financially in a year or two. Temporarily. Another harmless word disguising something ugly beneath it. And where exactly was I supposed to go during that time? Daniel opened his mouth, but no answer came out. Because there was no answer that would not sound cruel once spoken aloud. I looked at him carefully then. Really looked at him. The dark circles under his eyes. The tension in his jaw. The expensive watch still wrapped around his wrist despite everything collapsing around him financially. Daniel looked tired. Older. But beneath that exhaustion was still something worse. Weakness. He knew what Vanessa was doing was wrong, yet he kept choosing the comfort of avoiding conflict over protecting his own mother. She said you might be happier somewhere warmer, he murmured finally. I almost laughed then, not because it was funny, but because it was unbelievable how easily people can disguise selfishness as compassion. I stood and carried my untouched coffee cup to the sink. Do you remember the winter you broke your arm sledding behind this house? I asked quietly. Daniel blinked in surprise at the sudden question. What? You were 11. Harold carried you through 3 feet of snow to the car because the ambulance could not reach the driveway. Daniel stared at me silently. You cried the entire ride to the hospital because you thought you ruined Christmas. My voice remained calm. Steady. Do you remember what I told you that night? His eyes lowered slowly toward the table. You said Christmas was not about things.
No, I correcte sufli.
I said family takes care of each other first. The silence after that felt heavier than anything we had said all afternoon. Then Daniel quietly stood, pulled on his coat, and walked toward the front door without finishing his coffee. But right before leaving, he stopped with his hand on the doorknob and spoke without turning around. Vanessa already scheduled a meeting with a care consultant next week. My chest tightened slightly. For me? Daniel closed his eyes briefly. She thinks you do not know yet. Then he walked out into the falling snow, leaving the front door slowly swinging shut behind him.